Roman Serbyn studied at McGill University, Université de Montreal, and La Sorbonne. He holds a PhD in history from McGill University, and his 1975 PhD thesis was The Character of the Rus Commonwealth, 1140 to 1200. He taught Russian and East European history at Collège de Saint-Marie in Montreal and Université du Quebec à Montréal from 1969 to 2002. In 1983, he organized at his university the first international conference on the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33. And I might add, for those of you present, there are the 5 last copies of that book that will ever be for sale out in the foyer. So if you'd like him to sign it later, please pick up one of them. We won't be reprinting it, looks like. Dr. Serbyn is a member of the Canadian Association of Slavists, the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences in Canada, and the Shevchenko Scientific Society. His research interests gravitate towards the national question, and he has written on such topics as the Ukrainian national revival in the 1860s and 1870s, the famine of 1921-22, the Ukrainian genocide of the 1930s, and the Ukrainian involvement in World War II. In 2009, he co-founded Holodomor Studies, a journal devoted to the multifaceted and comparative examination of the Ukrainian genocide. Professor Serbyn.
Thank you, Professor Sisson. Now, you've heard me yesterday and today complaining about the fact that they only gave me 20 minutes. When I got the program and I saw, well, everybody's got 2 hours and I got 20 minutes, what's happening? And then, as I was coming to Toronto, it dawned on me, this was done on purpose. What I have to say is the gospel truth. There's no need for a commentator after that, and there's no need for discussion. It'll be so clear, it'll go down, and this will be the great change here at this conference. So actually, I am very flattered by the fact that they limited it. But speaking seriously, in case Professor Sisson decides to use his threat and I get cut off, I would like to tell you that my article, which goes into detail what I'm saying here, is published in a book, Raphael Lemkin, A Hero of Humanity. This was a conference in Warsaw 5 years ago, a commemoration of Lemkin. I gave a paper and they printed it, and now this paper is on Academia Edu. Most of you are familiar with that. You can go there and you can get the whole paper. Now, I'll begin you can start timing me now. Okay? That was just a preliminary. Now, my paper, I've changed the title a little bit, not much, from the Great Famine to the Holodomor, conceptualization, or conceptualizing the Ukrainian genocide. And I'll start the first paragraph of the paper that I have written, or at least writing, but which I obviously will not be able to read here. The calamity that befell Ukraine during Stalin's revolution from above is identified by 3 terms: famine, genocide, and Holodomor, with growing preference for the third. However, there is ambiguity with regard to the term's meaning. Some people use Holodomor as a synonym for genocide, others equate it with famine, and still others consider all 3 terms equal. You've heard that during this conference. Semantic confusion may be convenient for politicians, including the present president of Ukraine, but scholars strive for clarity and precision. In this latter perspective, I propose to examine the origin, evolution, and significance of each of the 3 terms, and to suggest a utilization of the neologism Holodomor, which will subsume in its definition the other 2 notions. That is what my paper is about. In the short presentation today, I will concentrate on 2 elements from the central part of the paper which deal with genocide, namely Lemkin's conceptualization of the Ukrainian genocide within the parameters of the UN Convention on Genocide, and Stalin's intent to commit genocide as revealed by Soviet archives. Now, much of this material, we have already seen it. What I'm trying to do here is maybe put it together in a slightly different way and present it in a different way. Now, you have been given the texts or excerpts of the documents that I'll be using. So if we'll just look at this, I hope this works. I was told how to do it. No, I guess somebody help me again. Well, I'm pressing the right buttons, but which am I supposed to point this? Oh, okay. No, could you put it on the first page? Is that the first page? Okay. Yeah, next page. Okay. So here you have the convention, and I'll try to talk. Okay. Now, Convention on the Prevention of... Now, this is 1948 Convention. Here are the main principal points. All periods of history, famine, or rather genocide took place. This is something that the professor went into yesterday. And genocide is committed in time of peace and war, because one of the objections to the Ukrainian genocide was that it was peacetime, and therefore, no, it fits also. And then the second article is the most important. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following. These have to be acts. It's not enough just to think, to wish to have genocide, but there has to be act. Act committed with intent. And the key word here is intent, and we've seen this, that this is very difficult to prove, but it has to be proven. The intent to destroy what? In whole and in part, groups as such. Now, in whole or in part, in other words, you don't have to destroy the whole group, but which groups? National, ethnical, racial, and religion. Now, the first problem is, if we apply this to Ukrainian, is that if we're talking only about the famine of the peasantry, it does not fit into this. Keep that in mind. Then you're talking about national and ethnical. What's the difference? Very often, some people think, well, it's the same thing. And I know that in Ukraine, in the beginning, when they started writing about this, very often they left out the ethnic because they figured it was the same thing. No, it's two different things. The ethnical, well, that's clear. But the national means nations, in other words, another nation, state, or a part of. And this, for example, in Yugoslavia or former Yugoslavia, when they applied this to some of the conflicts, and in Africa, it was used in that sense. So this is political and not and ethnical is different. Now, how does this apply to Ukraine? Well, in Ukraine, the Ukrainian ethnical group is not only in Ukraine. And one of the problems, as I said, in studying the genocide in Ukraine, is that they limit to Ukraine. What about 8 million Ukrainians in 1926, according to 1926 census, that were in Russia, RSFSR, and elsewhere in the Soviet Union? Well, this is the ethnical group. The national group is the group, all the citizens of Ukraine. So if we're looking at the victims of genocide in Ukraine, they are two overlapping groups. In a political sense, all the citizens of Ukraine living on the territory of the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, including Russians, Jews, Armenians, and so on. These are Ukrainian citizens, these are national Ukrainians. And the ethnic group is the Ukrainians in Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians, and the 8 million Ukrainians living outside. These two groups overlap. This is something that is not taken into consideration, or at least not presented that way when it is being studied. And here, the next thing, oh yes, groups as such. Again, the idea, a very important idea, is that genocide is directed against groups, not individuals. And this will becomes clear when we look at the examples that are given. If you look at the example, well, killing, that's obvious. Causing serious bodily and mental harm, that's obvious. Okay, that's physical destruction and so on. Even the third one, which was quoted, I think, by Professor Kulczewski and others, the deliberate or the creating of conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. But look at the last two. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth. There's no destruction. It's preventing. But there is a destruction of the group because it prevents the group to perpetuate itself to continue. And then the last one is even more telling. Look at the last one. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. I've never seen this apply to Ukrainian case. Why not? If you transfer children, you do not destroy them. Actually, you save them. You're doing them a service in a way, because the parents will be destroyed, but they will be saved. So it's not that. But what's happening, the genocidal aspect of it, is that the group has suffered because it has lost these children that have been transferred and maybe saved and become good citizens and so on of another group. Now, if you apply this to Ukraine, if we're talking about children, what about the whole groups? What about the whole family? When the family is deported to Siberia and their children are Russified and their grandchildren become good citizens of Russia, well, that's a loss to Ukraine. That's part of the genocide. All these things have to be included. Now, Lemkin, you know who Lemkin is. When he was invited to speak in 1953 before 3,000 Ukrainians in New York at the Manhattan Center, he conceptualized the Ukrainian genocide within the framework of the United Nations Convention. It was mentioned that Lemkin talked about social groups and so on and so on. Yes, he wrote that in his book, which, by the way, should be translated into Ukrainian. Axis rule in occupied Europe should be translated into Ukrainian. I'm making an appeal to both Ukrainian scholars and Western youth and so on to have it translated. It's very important. Anyway, in this application of his ideas, he makes sure that it fits the United Nations Convention. And that's why he's talking about, well, we had this quoted before, but we can go to the next page where he, please. Okay, and he talks about the four-pronged attack on the Ukrainian nation. This was his title. Soviet genocide in Ukraine, not Soviet famine in Ukraine, Soviet genocide. This is Lemkin in 1953. And we're, what, 60 years later? Okay, now the first blow is aimed at the intelligentsia, the national brain. So you paralyze, you kill the brain, you paralyze the body. The second is churches. And here note that he has a long-term, longue durée of history, and also colonialism, which fits with the other quotation before that. He's talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is in 1930, and then he's talking about the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is in 1946. So you have the longue durée. That's part of the Ukrainian genocide. And then he explains why it's, the Ukrainian Church, because it was not just a clergy like in Latin church, but you have married clergies with their families and so on, their role, social role, and so on, the importance of that. Also, if we go back here to the intelligentsia and apply it to Ukraine, well, the destruction of the intelligentsia was 1929, the arrest of several thousand people, and then in 1930, the trial of SVU and SUM and so on. Well, that's part of the destruction. Now, if we go back to 1929 and 30, you have dekolakization. Now, dekolakization is usually seen as an attack on Ukrainian peasantry. It's seen as economic, which doesn't really make much sense. Why would he get rid of the best workers? But we do not analyze it as part of the intelligentsia and part of the elites. Maybe we substitute elites for intelligentsia, it'll be clearer. It was 80% or 75% of Ukrainian ethnic nation and Ukrainian state is peasantry. And the leadership, the elites of the peasantry, are, first of all, the higher elites, say, in the cities, intelligentsia, and so on, and then the lower elites on the level of the kolkhoz, well, eventually kolkhoz, but the village is the richer so-called kulaks, also priests, because very often priests and others were put in this category. That's very interesting. And also interesting how he compares the destruction in Ukraine with the destruction of Jews by Nazi. I don't have time to go into that, but that's also very revealing. Could you have next, please? Now, and here you have 3 and 4. This is very important. Here he's talking about the farmers or the peasants, and he says the independent. Independent, in other words, before collectivization. Now, this is not exact because collectivization has gone further than, but anyway, the idea, important idea here is that he presents this group, which is overwhelming the majority of the population of Ukraine, as the group that preserves, that is repository of Ukrainian language, folklore, and so on, and he calls it the national spirit of Ukraine. This is the important thing. This is what makes a genocide all-inclusive and which finds the proper place of the Ukrainian peasantry. And then the fourth one is the mixing of population and so on. Well, this, unfortunately, Lemkin does not go into Ukrainians living outside the Soviet Ukraine. However, we can take this as a starting point to talk about Ukrainians living outside Ukraine in Kuban and so on. That could be sort of included when we're analyzing as historians this part. Okay, that was the fourth point. Next, please. Okay, so Lemkin's conclusion. Well, you have that, and you have that on your sheet. I don't have the time to go over it. And he says, the plan that the Soviets used is an essential part of Soviet program for expansion. This brings us into colonialism, bringing unity out of diversity, the cultures, natures, and so on. He was, by the way, he was not against assimilation, as long as it's peaceful and so on. And he says, United States is a place where people assimilate, they come and so on. But it's the forceful assimilation which is part of genocide, as far as he's concerned. And then he says the loss to humanity when you have this loss of a particular culture, of a particular ethnic group, and so on. Next, please. Now, conceptualization, or the strong points of his conceptualizing. First of all, it is within the parameters of the United Nations Convention. That was one of the points that was always brought against, Ukrainian genocide. Well, it doesn't fit the United Nations. Lemkin's conceptualization does. Second, it brings in all the victims and not just the peasants into the picture. Third, Lemkin puts it in a longue durée. Here again, this fits in with the idea of not genocide as a result of colonialism, but genocide in the context of colonialism. This is the important thing. The context of colonialism over the history. You go way back in history to ancient times when the empires expanded and so on. There was always some element of genocide, at least the way we see it now. In those days, it wasn't seen that way. Okay, and fourth relation. Next. Now, this point is very important, I think. We're talking about, I put there, well, obviously this doesn't belong to Stalin, he didn't quote it, but I think it's still good. By their fruits you shall know them. Read this first. Prokopenko, an activist, a plenipotentiary of one of the regions in Ukraine, south of Kharkiv. He is overheard by somebody who denounces him, and then this is reported through the OGPU files. And this is what he says, and this is verbally translated. Starvation in Ukraine was brought about in order to reduce the number of Ukrainians, resettle in their place people from another part of the USSR, and in this way kill all thought of independence. You have here the motive and the intent in one together. This is what the lower cadres of the administration saw. Obviously, he did not invent this. He got it, he heard it from higher up. Now, you have it on your sheet. I don't have it here, but maybe you can take a look at your sheet. I think it's on page, on page, what page is it? 3? Khatayevich, Kosior Khatayevich. Well, Kosior says the famine still hasn't taught many kolkhozniki a lesson. This is March 1933, beginning. And then Khatayevich, here's what he says, and this is again in 33. A violent struggle is taking place between the peasantry and our government, a struggle to the death. It took a famine to show that them who the master is. It costs millions of lives. Now these things were written, these things were said, and so on. They were heard, and they were known within the party, the ranks, and so on. So this was nothing invented by the diaspora or anything of that sort. And if we go to the next one, those were the sort of the lower cadres, if you wish, and here you have the higher cadres. You have Belitsky, the head of the GPU, sent especially by Stalin, and then Postishov, who was his right-hand man. And this is what they say. During the second half of 1931-32, that's what we referred to before, the uprisings and so on and so on, profound failures were permitted. Who were they permitted by? They were permitted by the by the leadership, Kosior and so on, who were not effective enough. And immediately lend this nationality. Okay, thanks to the decisive intervention, note, decisive intervention of our party CC and Comrade Stalin personally. Comrade Stalin intervened all the time. During the SVU trial in 1930, he gave directions, don't forget the doctors and so on, they have to be also brought in and so on and so on. This was direct. He knew, not the question is that he just, whether he knew or not. He was directing the operation, and here it is. This is stated black on white, And then if you continue with Postishov, last year, the defeat of this is January 1934, but he says, last year, was the defeat of the nationalist counter-revolution, the exposure and the defeat of the nationalist bias led by Skripnik. Well, by that time he had committed suicide and so on. The power and significance of daily management of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and Comrade Stalin. Here again, everything goes up to Stalin. And then when it was said, beat him, the nationalists, the counter-revolutionary, beat this scum, beat harder, don't be afraid. These activists, party members and Komsomol members started working, Bolshevik style, and the collective farm progressed. Okay, next please. Now, let's go to Stalin's, okay, you have here in June 10th, 1932, Petrovsky, and Trubar also, but Petrovsky writes, and where he complains, he says, look, people are starving. I've been, they reproach me. They say, what is the party doing? Also, he said, why don't they allow us to go to Russia and get the food which is lacking in Ukraine, and for some reason it's in Russia. Already here they're being, so the 22 January 1933 law which which closed the borders, in practice it was already existing here. Because, well, I don't have the whole text, but if you read the whole text, you'll find it. And then he says, and the threat is here, starving peasants will pick unripe grain. They're gonna, ruin the harvest and so on. So his expectation was that when Stalin realizes that, then he'll back down, and he'll say, allow him to keep more food and so on and so on. This is 10th. On the 15th, Stalin writes to Kaganovich, says, I did not like the letter, but Petrovsky also didn't like the other one either. Ukraine received more than they should. The worst thing, Kosior is silent. And this is what the upper echelons, Kosior and so on, are not doing a good job. Okay, and then Stalin writes, he blames the internal things in Ukraine, the mismanagement and so on. He says a number of fertile districts in Ukraine are in a state of impoverishment and famine. This is the only reference that I have found in archive or in published documents where Stalin uses the term famine. I don't know, maybe Andrea found others, but I haven't. And then if we skip over and we go to the 20th of July, notice it's not very far, just 6 weeks later, or 5 weeks later, he says this. This is where he proposes. He says he proposes to formulate a law. And this is the 5 years of corn law, in other words, which says for theft of kolkhoz property, it'll be execution or 10 years. And then you have, on the 7th of August, you have the promulgation of this law. Next, please. Note, 7th of August. Note, 11th of August. 4 days later, Stalin writes this famous or infamous letter that everybody quotes, but in my opinion, not many explain it the way it should be. The decree is good, and will soon have impact. Will soon have impact. He knows what's going to happen. And then he says, and these are the last two quotations, so the most important thing right now is Ukraine. Ukrainian affairs have hit rock bottom. Things are bad with regard to the party. The party is not doing its job in Ukraine. Now, there is talk that there were five oblasts, regions, oblasts of Ukraine. It seems Kiev and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. About 50 rayons, I think it was 400 and something rayons, 50 rayons, party committees. Now, these are party people. Party committees have spoken out against grain procurement plan, deeming it unrealistic. They say it can't be done. Well, sure, hell can be done. The sound's going to make sure it can be done. Okay? Now, the situation in another rayon party committee is no better. Instead of leading the rayon, Kosyor has been maneuvering. Things are bad in the Soviet. That's the administration, the state. Things are bad in the party. Things are bad in the Soviet. Trubar is no leader. He was the head of the government. He's no leader. Things are bad in the GPU. I mean, how bad can it get when it's in the GPU? You know, and Redens, again, the head of the GPU, is not up to leading and so on. And then he proposes changes and so on, and eventually Redens will be replaced by Belitsky, Posteshov will be, next please, sent in, and so on. And here is the last part, and I think this is crucial. You're back? I don't trust you. If we do not undertake now to correct the situation, what does it mean now to correct the situation? Which situation? It's not the grain situation. It's the situation, the political situation. The regions, the lower and the middle and the lower cadres are revolting, or potentially they can revolt. Not Kosyor and so on. They're faithful. They're useless, but they're faithful. But the lower, there's 500,000. Okay, now you see. Keep in mind that Pilsudski is not dozing off, and his agents in Ukraine are many times stronger than the Red. That's bull. By this time, the Soviet Union signed a treaty with Poland. There's no threat. And by this time, also, the Polish agents that did exist in Ukraine had been picked up and so on. No, this is, you see, one of the things is, Stalin conceptualizes and sends messages. These messages are picked up by the Politburo, in this case, Kaganovich and so on. They're then passed on to the Central Committee, and then they're passed down the line. And as I said yesterday, in a month or two, you find them on the village level. That's the way it worked. Now, okay, so he says, keep in mind, too, that the Ukrainian Communist Party, 500,000 members. Ha, ha, ha. Actually, Professor Kulchetsky told me worse than ha, ha, ha. It was he, 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 which is a sort of derogatory way of laughing, if I understood it properly. Has quite a lot, yes, quite a lot of rotten elements, conscious and unconscious, Petlurus, and finally, direct agents of Pilsudski. Well, I explained that already about the direct agents of Pilsudski. As soon as things get worse. Now, this is crucial. In one of the translations, I mentioned this yesterday, it was translated, if things get worse. No, it's as soon. He knows things will get worse. He promulgated a law. He just explained what it will do, and so on. So as things get worse, как только дело станет хуже, these elements will waste no time opening a front inside and outside the party against the party. Who will revolt? It's the Russian word smichka, the alliance of the middle and lower cadres. Don't forget, 500,000 people, where did they come from? A lot of them came from the countryside. These were people who had relatives in the countryside who were starving. Or when there will be an alliance between, if there is an alliance between the two, then there will be trouble in Ukraine. And then they'll turn against the party. The worst aspect is that Ukrainian leadership does not see it, Kosyor and so on. Well, you have to replace them. To my mind, this is the best proof we have of Stalin's intent, and I think this should be used. This is my interpretation. This is the gospel truth, but then there are a lot of unfaithful people, so you're free to accept it or to reject it. Thank you very much for your attention.
But we have not done so. We are coming to the end of our conference and the beginning of our reception. There will be a number of other activities I'll be announcing as well, and we hope that you will also attend some of these events. But just a few words about the conference and a few words about REC as we come to this concluding moment. Man proposes, God disposes. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Those are all the fates of conference organizers. We come up with concepts and conceptualizations, invite our colleagues who are willing to undertake these tasks and requests, but of course are going to reinterpret them and do them as they choose. So how do we look at it now as we come to this point? And how would I look at it from where we thought of this conference to what we have heard just now? We wanted to be somewhat different. We wanted to say we won't once again talk about the events of the Holodomor, various interpretations, and their significance. We will try and discuss how this relates to other topics and in fields where we saw clearly that 30 years ago little attention was paid to the Holodomor. But our colleagues and our public often decide and interpret as they choose. So where do I think we got? We got halfway. We got half our way and half other ways. These other ways were also, I think, creative and innovative, and they also answered specific needs and questions as we went. And so in that way, I'm going to declare 100% success and not a 50-50 on our conference as we went on this. And I'm very grateful to our speakers for undertaking this. Now, when I think of this, and it's been interesting to hear a few people say, oh, young people in Ukraine say, why do you do this anymore? Why are you going to study these events? Or people say, why do we study tragic events? And now let's make Ukrainian history do the positive sides and the achievements. I think one thing that has been clear is that although tremendous advances have been made on studying the events and knowledge about them, we still have a long way to go to really, I think, understand these phenomena. And when I think of this, I just in this sessions have heard from someone who in 1970 proposed to the University of Toronto History Department to write about the famine in Ukraine and was told that that really wasn't a topic worth writing on. That is, so if we look where things were in 1970 and what the attitude would have been of taking up the topic, certainly those advances are great, but they also tell us why we are not further along. And the events in Ukraine, political, but also economic, the fact that our colleagues in Ukraine work in difficult circumstances, that the average university instructor has so many hours that it is almost shameful when we tell them how little teaching North Americans and Europeans do compared to what they do. We can understand why there is really so much to do. So a lot has been done, a lot is to do. The other issue that I'm struck with at this conference is that, still we can get engaged and at times emotional. Now, fortunately, our last speaker can clearly proclaim what most academics usually would like to say, which is just listen and I'll tell you the way it was. We pretend frequently that is not so, but that involves the issue of voice and getting a voice. And that's been another, I think, topic behind our conference, and of groups that feel dispossessed, and in many ways of varying groups who do not understand that frequently it is the dispossessed that do not wish to listen to the dispossessed. And I think that is much of the history of what we can talk the Holodomor, which has become part of academic politics as it developed in North America, as well as the general political context. I just came back from Ukraine, and in this wonderful world of internet, someone handed me an article that my uncle wrote in 1934 in New Jersey about have we failed about getting out knowledge about the Ukrainian famine? That is, and saying, a lot of people are saying we haven't succeeded, but we got to the Hearst Press. I didn't know this until now, that the Ukrainians got to the Hearst Press in this, and therefore a lot of people know what's happened that haven't happened. But the question was already there. We didn't do enough, we couldn't stop it, we can't get our message through. And that has been, of course, what particularly in the North American context, so I think sometimes our colleagues from Ukraine don't quite understand how monomaniacally the Ukrainian diaspora wants attention on the Holodomor. And a lot of that is the feeling long of not having voice, of having professors who told you, no, it wasn't a topic worth studying, or with the rise of the revisionists at times, pulling our punches and talking with our colleagues, because academic politics meant you weren't going to really tell them what you thought when you wanted to say to them, look, wake up, there is a nationality problem in the Soviet Union, and nationality and nation have their role. Now, what we used to do back at Harvard when these things would come up, and then a little bit at our conference, one of I think the great achievements of study of famine was a major exhibit done at Widener Library in 1986, organized by Oksana Protzik, who is with us today, our librarian. It is a fantastic exhibit, and a wonderful catalog was put out on this. I think many of you have seen this catalog. So at that point, Marta Bazyuk, and we are all a cast of characters that's been at this a long time, was working at our institute. And every time I was particularly annoyed by something the revisionists had written, I'd say, send them a famine catalog, and hope that maybe pictures would convince them that this was worth looking at. I think many of these I hope they didn't throw them away. At least they wound up in libraries, even though I doubt that they read them at that time. But at least we were moving forward. But it sometimes then makes us strident. And after all, we did a bit of talking about the eyewitnesses. And one of the most phenomenal parts of the famine story was how eyewitnesses could be dismissed because they were strident. You know, after all, why hadn't they learned to couch things in proper academic terms and put it in the right intellectual context? And that should teach us, and I would say, and in this case, of course, Ukrainians should, and Ukrainians as a collective of many kinds and identities and political ideas, but it should teach us also to listen to other voices we might not be particularly favorable to, because having had this done to, in quotes, us, it would be a good way to learn that we should never do this to anyone else or any other groups or kinds of history that we at first find strange and little worthy of endeavor or would like to say are really not the topics that should be done at any one time and place. Now, what I also would like, and I will cut short on our Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, but of course what we have, our answer is more research done on the Holodomor? Clearly yes. That we think more needs to be done. I must say I cannot argue what I would have hoped to have argued even 10 or 15 years ago, that with the achievement of Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian historical studies would become depoliticized. It has achieved a certain way in mainstream academia outside of Ukraine. Great progress has been made. Certain element, many people of non-Ukrainian background have been brought into the field. That has changed the field. And of course, this conference has been a great testimony, and particularly our 17 graduate students and young scholars who've come to us. I mean, there are a number of Ukrainian names within the group, but many, many non-Ukrainian names. And that, I think, already shows progress for the field. But as far as the dealing with the Holodomor, we are still in a stage when the Ukrainian government will play politics with this, that Ukrainian governments will shift. I found it interesting, by the way, in the shift, I had certain academics spoke out when Yushchenko seemed to be playing politics with the famine and famine events, who now are remarkably silent. But then maybe there were those who were silent in protesting with Yushchenko, who are now more vocal about criticizing the Yanukovych government. But clearly, we are at a point and a position where this is a political issue in Ukraine. I think we have heard frequently about Mr. Soldatenko, and someone did get up and say, let's listen to his voice too, let's understand it. I think of others who may not be at that level of the spectrum of extreme, but I regularly send material to Georgi Kasyanov, who thinks that he can read the minds of the people who worked on the famine in the diaspora and knows what their motives were without having to bother with archival sources or documents which exist here, and then try and say to him, well, you've got the chronology wrong of why things were done, and yet we have a major book by a major scholar at the Institute of History, which I think, well, I think certain things of, and we can go along on that spectrum to the more politically motivated and clear issues. I mean, if we have a head of the archival administration of Ukraine who says, let's not talk about unpleasant things and don't bother looking at the sources to them anymore, well, then we know that maybe the idea of writing Pollyannish history is a little too early in Ukraine, and we've got to continue working in these fields. Now, in that, what we've tried to do here with our request to the Temerté Foundation was to say that this will then be a multi-pronged approach. It will try and further research academic communication, and it has a major academic wing. We have a number of research projects, but some of them are really related to outreach. That is, translating articles of our Ukrainian colleagues into English so that they can be available. Putting them online for a wider public is one part of what we're doing. The Holodomor reader, which you have all seen by now, was part of this project, but now we would like to get it out in French. And by the way, we have requests from Ukraine to get it out in Ukrainian, which I found interesting as well, that they would like it to come out. We have many projects that were done earlier. Dmytro Doroshenko and others commissioned right after World War II memoirs from Ukrainian emigres from Eastern Ukraine, which have been in the Oseredek, the major Ukrainian institution of Winnipeg, all these years. They were going to discuss World War II, but of course what they found out is that no one they stopped to ask about it would start World War II with 1939 or 1941. That is, they would always start and go back to the famine, those who had lived in Eastern Ukraine. And those materials have not been published, and with the great help of our colleagues in Ukraine and Ludmila Hranevich and others, we're going to get this material out. We are also, I think, doing a little exploration with our colleagues from Ukraine. That is, we all know of the Manyak volume, one of these first volumes of the testimonies of the Holodomor. We had heard that these materials were largely lost, that is, those that were not published, and of course that publication was extracts, not full letters. We had always known that due to the good work of the Ukrainian Canadian Documentation Center, that Iroya Devinnitska, the archivist, a woman of tremendous energy, had in Manyak's lifetime been able to Xerox some of these, and we thought we'd work with them, and we ultimately have found out that at least we're on the track of at least 700 of these that are still around, and we'll be able then, and they of course are particularly valuable because they were written in the late 1980s when adults who had lived through the Holodomor were alive, and so strangely enough we can return to Ukraine maybe something that one would have hoped that scholars in Ukraine would have by now found and published, and in that case we can work with them in that. So in cooperation with our colleagues in Ukraine and our many colleagues in North America, and then I'm particularly grateful to the many distinguished participants who had speak at this conference, and with that Valentina Corelliu, who's heading that part of our initiative and who has been working on this for decades, that is, and has stormed many a Ministry of Education throughout this wide land of Canada, and can tell you at length how difficult it is introducing material into a curriculum and how good material you need to convince them to do it. She's working on a major workbook now that can be used in schools, and if you don't have the material, you're not going to get the event in. It doesn't mean that many events that should be in. Many genocides that have occurred in the world, it is a shame they will not be in, but I'm afraid the realities are if there are not groups who will work on this, produce it, ministries of education and school boards are not going to create these on their own. So those are the general contours of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. I'll say a few more words about it when I wrap up fully. The event we now have is in a bit, this is in a way our initiation, but we have already had one major conference. We have been going since the 1st of January. That's when we finally got through the horrendous bureaucracy of the University of Alberta and actually could get the money to accounts where we could use. So we are a relatively new initiative. And this, I would think, is in many ways our inauguration, and that is the one thing we will be marking today. We had hoped that James and Louise Temerte could be here, but because of a personal event, they had to suddenly go out of town today. They were with us last night at a smaller reception where we were able to recognize them and acknowledge all they had done for this field. Our other event, which we will return to, is our 20-minute man, that is Professor Serbyn, and someone whom I will talk about a little bit more later. But before doing so, I'd like to call on Paul Grod, who is the head of the Ukrainian Congress Committee, to say a few words.
Distinguished scholars, dear participants in the inaugural conference of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, as the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, I want to, on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Ukrainian Canadian community, thank and congratulate the founders and the leaders of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. I'd like to recognize a few, in particular, Professor Roman Serbyn, who will be recognized this evening. I also want to recognize Mrs. Valentina Kureliu and also Professor Frank Sisson, and especially the leadership of James and Louise Temerte on this front. I also want to just spend just a moment here recognizing somebody who I've had the distinct pleasure to work with, both from an academic perspective and a community perspective, and that's Professor Roman Serbyn. Professor Serbyn, your leadership and resolve has been, quite frankly, an example to all of us. Professor Serbyn has led in academic discovery and education around the Holodomor. He has educated countless generations of Canadians. I, in particular, remember still as a young president of SUSK, the Союз Українського студентства Канади, the Ukrainian Canadian Students Union, listening to presentations at our conferences by Professor Serbyn. And I think and also Professor Serbyn has been an incredible advocate. And it's rare to find somebody who you can tie all those very key components together in. And Professor Serbyn has been a strong advocate on the recognition and commemoration of the Holodomor. In particular, I want to recognize Professor Serbyn for the work he's done in ensuring that the legislature of Quebec recognized the Holodomor as a genocide just a few years ago. And it wasn't an easy undertaking because I'll be very frank, that there were other diplomats and ambassadors, or an ambassador from another country who was very strongly advocating against the acceptance by the Quebec legislature of the Holodomor as a genocide. And that was described to me by the MLA from Quebec, who was the driving force behind that piece of legislation. And I know that Professor Serbyn was very instrumental in ensuring that the legislature and the government of Quebec recognized the Holodomor as a genocide. And also, now, Professor Serbyn also sits on the national board of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and I can always expect from Professor Serbyn his opinion, a frank and unvarnished opinion, which I always appreciate, and yes, credible, of course. And we have been encouraged, and I think have evolved as a community, to take the Holodomor outside of our community. And what I mean by that is Holodomor education. And just a few years ago, many of you probably remember the famine going on in the southern horn of Africa, where I know Professor Serbyn very much encouraged us and the Congress to get behind this initiative, where we worked very closely with the Somali Canadian community and raised some significant funds, close to $250,000 from our community, to actually help in famine relief. And we were actually had many of our Holodomor survivors involved in this campaign to actually introduce the Holodomor to the Somali Canadian community, something they never knew about. So these are ways that we as a community continue to educate others about it, and I want to thank and recognize Professor Serbyn for his leadership in that role.
Bravo, bravo.
The role of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium is extremely important to our community. It's extremely important to both the Ukrainian and Canadian community and to the worldwide Ukrainian community. And I know that the Ukrainian World Congress, which I'm vice president of, is very supportive of HREC, and we hope to see HREC become the center of excellence for Holodomor research and education in the world. So we've got big hopes and big expectations. I also want to talk about this in the context of we have a lot of work ahead of us. In particular, many of you have heard of some of the controversy around the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And in fact, in today's National Post, there is a large article in which I'm quoted talking about the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and the controversy behind it. And I have to tell you that this is just an example of why we need to be, and especially the academic community, need to bring this into the mainstream. So it is recognized as an important human rights teaching tool. As we've advocated to the leadership of the museum, that the Holodomor is the lens through which to view the crimes of communism. And we have the full support of the Central and Eastern European communities, among others, in that quest. It's also an opportunity to teach how food has and continues to be used as a tool to oppress peoples. And we see that happening in today's world, and that's why it's important to teach. It's not just important for us to feel, that we've been harmed, but it's an important teaching tool of how we can educate the world and make the world a better place today. So it's very, very important. Now, also there's some hopeful things that are in the horizon, and Member of Parliament Ted Opitz will talk about the Victims of Communism Memorial that we're looking to build in Canada's capital. But I won't steal Mr. Opitz's thunder on that, because it's a very important initiative that the Central and Eastern European communities, together with the Government of Canada, are working on. In conclusion, I'd like to again congratulate HREC, and we as the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Ukrainian Canadian community look forward to working together to further academic research, education, and raising awareness about the Holodomor. Thank you very much.
Now, Canada is, of course, one of the countries that recognizes the Holodomor as a genocide, and that's been due to the work of many parliamentarians. We are pleased today that Member of Parliament Ted Opitz, who is chair of the Canadian-Ukrainian Parliamentary Friendship Group in Ottawa, will be able to speak and say a few words about their activities.
Good day. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to participate with you as the chair of the Canada-Ukraine Friendship Parliamentary Group. I'm very happy to be here because it is a nonpartisan, all-party group that represents and supports the Ukrainian community. Paul is a frequent visitor and a contributor to this, and he's been a stalwart in helping all parliamentarians better understand the Ukrainian community, diaspora, and the culture and the Holodomor, because it is very important to mark this as an educational event, not only in Canada, and as you know, our government has recognized the Holodomor because it's a very important thing to do. It's a very important teaching tool. Famine is used as a weapon. And it's apropos that Paul mentioned the Somalis, because in fact there is a visit coming up of Somali foreign minister for the first time here to Canada in a long time. And it's a good thing because they've learned those lessons, and that collaboration between communities like that, and two communities that you wouldn't necessarily think would get along on that level, is a very powerful thing. And I applaud the UCC for reaching out and doing that and raising funds for that community, because Canada has given a considerable amount of money, well over $175 million into the Horn of Africa and into Somalia itself to accommodate and look after people that are most in need right now, and many are. There are 100 million displaced people in Somalia presently, and a million outside displaced in other countries. So they're having challenging times, and being able to learn from the Ukrainian experience in the Holodomor is hugely important and valuable to us all. I do hope that this reaches a curriculum in schools and becomes a regular part of it, because those of us of Eastern European backgrounds understand the totalitarian governments that have oppressed us and have used not only famine but other things as weapons to injure people on a massive scale, not only through the 30s, but the 40s and even through the 50s, and Stalinist times in particular are those that are most poignant. Our government is, of course, also, along with the Central and Eastern European communities, erecting Tribute to Liberty. We've worked on that. We've announced it recently with Jason Kenney, Chris Alexander. The Prime Minister is very much behind it, and of course is a recipient of the Shevchenko Medal that Paul presented him just about a couple of years ago now, and will be honored again shortly at another event. So that is something that we are pressing very, very hard. Central and Eastern European communities have come together as a coalition, as we always have. This has been going on for 50 years, and again, that community has risen once again to band together, to ally itself, and fight for a very important cause. And we're continually raising money for that. The ground has been chosen. It's across from the Supreme Court of Canada. It's in a fantastic location, or will be, sorry, when it is actually erected. And that's a very important thing. So we're very pleased from our government, and on behalf of the Prime Minister and on behalf of the Honourable Jason Kenney, who's our Minister of Multiculturalism, and Chris Alexander, they're all very, very pleased to continue to work with the Ukrainian diaspora and make sure that those things that are very important to this community are communicated very loudly. And things like, for example, providing over 500 observers to the election last year. That was a very important event. Prime Minister launched that personally, and I think it was effective. However, we have to continue with a full court press on that going forward in other elections, and vigilance is very, very important. Communities here, like the UCC and League of Ukrainian Canadians, and so many other groups that are part of the UCC are very valuable to me personally as the chair of the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group, because you provide me with a lot of insight. And I see Walter Dershko in the front here, and he's always on me with a lot of good information that he provides, and keeps us up to date with what is going on in Ukraine. And we're very, very cognizant of that. In fact, John Baird at Independence Day on August 24th has offered Yulia Tymoshenko medical treatment here in Canada, should she desire it. And of course, if the Ukrainian government sees fit to allow her to come here to get that treatment, and I hope they do. Germany has also offered, and I believe a couple of other European countries have offered. So we continue on that path, and we continue to engage because it's important to do that, and we continue to engage with the community because it's important to do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's quite an honor. Thank you.
I might add that Boris Jasnevsky, former member of parliament, longtime activist in many of the activities associated with the Holodomor, had hoped to be here and couldn't make it because of another engagement, but was last night at a reception we had with Louise and Jim Temerte. And we hope that the tymczasowo wykonujący obowiązki generalnego konsula Anatoly Hryhorovich Olinek will be at the reception, but he has not yet arrived, and so we also had greetings from the consulate. And now on to our honoree, who those of you who have been at the conference and those of you in the Ukrainian community know Roman Serbyn well. When we think of Roman Serbyn and what he has meant for our community, and what he means for academia, I think he has played a remarkable role as someone dedicated to scholarship, and scholarship in its broadest sense. That is, after all, he wrote a thesis on Kievan Rus. Omelian Pritsak would say he's a historian, that means. He then transferred his interest to later periods, and he worked on the formative Ukrainian political movements of the 19th century. He dealt with the great journal Osnova. He dealt with the person of Podolinsky. He dealt with contacts among communities between Ukrainians and Jews and discussions throughout the 19th century. He then moved on and worked on the period of the revolution, or the beginning of the 20th century. And one can go through his bibliography in at least 2 and more languages, 3, Ukrainian, English, and French. And to us, the French was in many ways the most important in a certain way, because he was our representative in Quebec. He was someone who understood Quebec in a way that I fear most of the rest of Canada and many of the Ukrainians, even of Montreal, do not. His connections with the various political movements and establishments in Quebec meant that the Ukrainian issue reached them in a way it would not have been had he not been so active. And therefore, in all those ways, I think, as well, he was trained as an East European historian to understand a national situation and multinational areas and multilinguistic zones. So Montreal was really a true home for him. It was also a place when we connected that Roman would come to all of our various activities. His voice was to be heard. It was not to be missed in ours. And he told it the way he saw it. I, a little bit earlier, mentioned that in some ways I thought Ukrainians might frequently sound strident because their voice hadn't been heard in many circles. And as we attain a certain age, we get to tell the youth how easy you have it, not the way we did it, yes. We turn to the student associations and say, the great congresses of the Union of Ukrainian Students of Canada of the 1960s and 70s, when all worked for the idea, where no class assignment could supplant nacionalna sprava or obowiązek, where students would learn to tackle the most authoritarian of professors to point out that it was not Kiev in Russia they were talking about, and they should say Kiev in Rus. But it was indeed a period in which was formative for the Ukrainian community of Canada, formative in many ways for its integration into greater Canadian society, and was a time when, together with the multicultural policy of Canada, together with the bilingualism that came to Canada in this age, there was a place for Ukrainians, and Ukrainians played a major role in many of these policies. That multiculturalism was in many ways, if not a Ukrainian plot, Ukrainians were co-conspirators in those who brought in the multicultural policy. And in certain ways, discussions went on even with Quebec and the major officials of Quebec. The other part of what Roman has done with all of his many scholarly interests, he has always concentrated on the issues of the various famines, holodomors, and genocides in Ukraine. That is long before I think many even realized that Roman was studying the 1921-22 famine and representing this at scholarly congresses. He took on the first major conference, as you have heard, in 1983 that was held in Montreal, on the famine, in which a major volume appeared from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and therefore was through this able to reach out to a broader audience in discussing, in examining, and in trying to give a full interpretation of what had occurred in Ukraine. And then he has often worked without the structures. We have, in certain ways, as the Ukrainian community built major structures in Alberta, in Winnipeg. Once Saskatoon had a greater structure than it has. Of course, in Harvard, in time, Columbia has come, and Stanford, and a number of other universities where we can say that through time structures were created. That has not, I think it's been a failing of the community not to pay sufficient attention to Montreal, but what has meant is that Roman has really worked on his own frequently, carrying on these projects, and took over and is the founder of the Holodomor Journal, and managed to fill issues up without an easy way to do it, and has had contact with scholars in Ukraine and goes to numerous conferences and congresses. And the other is that he has been an open voice, a frank voice in Ukraine as well as in the West. He has engaged in political debates and discussions over many issues, and these become particularly important now given the current political trends in Ukraine. And I think his voice has therefore been an important one. So that when we were thinking how to begin our Holodomor research and education program, we thought one of the first things we should do is recognize Roman for all of his work on the study of the famine genocide of the Holodomor, and we are privileged today to give him a copy of the official Holodomor statue from Ukraine. A number of copies were made of that statue in recognition for all he has done. So, Roman, if you would come up.
Well, thank you very much. And after that wonderful introduction, he says, now you have 3 more minutes and not a second more. Okay, I will not use a second more. I think I'm supposed to say that I'm humbled by this, so I'll say that. On the other hand, I always thought that humility is not part of scholarship, it's truth. So it's not really that important to me whether I'm humble or not, or whether an author is humble or not, as long as what he writes and what he says is the truth. This, for me, is the same. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody. I'm sorry if I took too much time or too loud or whatever. And I think this is the first part of my recognition. The second part of my recognition, you know, is when you follow my ideas. Thank you very much.
All right, now we had promised you a reception, but with us there is nothing given without obligation. Now, the obligation is a number of very pleasant obligations that you have as you examine this building, which is an extremely important one for the Ukrainian Toronto community, for the Ukrainian cultural world, that is this institute and what it has in it. Now, I remind you that on the first floor, the Ukrainian Women's Association has an exhibit on the banduriste, and that exhibit is open now, and it is something I think worth seeing. In the boardroom, there is an exhibit on the Hutsuls. The Hutsuls, fortunately, in the Carpathians, did not undergo the Holodomor, but worthy to see the culture that they have left, a quite unique culture in the Ukrainian experience. We invite you at the end of your travels up to the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, where we have some refreshments for you, that part of our reception. However, one thing that you are not allowed to miss is at 5:30 in the theater on the first floor. 5:15, I'm being told, but Andrei told me 5:30. Okay, I get many instructions, by the way, in writing this. There will be a showing of the Harvard Map GIS project. I am extremely interested in this because I frequently discuss this with Serhiy Ploki and Roman Protsik, and I haven't got the faintest idea what a GIS is, so that I better had learned these things. I know, yes, we have to learn on it. Harvard is going to be a major partner in our cooperation of the new Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. It has been good that not only did Harvard work actively in the 1970s and 80s at bringing the Ukrainian famine and Holodomor to public attention, but that it continues this work, and this is a very important project, and please, as many of you as possible, make your way to the theater. Then I have thanked the organization sponsors. You have them in your program. The funders who have assisted in us carrying on this conference. I wish to thank particularly our speakers, our chairs, our discussants, our graduate students, and the many, many people who have come to this conference. It was a bit overwhelming when we realized how many people were going to be attending, but it's a delight to look out and see all of you here, and so I thank you very much for taking part of it. You know, conferences are great plans that will go nowhere without people who do them. And there have been many people who have worked on doing this. We have worked with Lydia Smilka here at the St. Vladimir Institute, with the Ukrainian Canadian Documentation Center and the staff there, whom you will be seeing upstairs. Our colleagues over at the Munk Center, whom Peter Solomon represented, and you met many of the people when you came in. And of course, our CIUS Toronto office, which has worked hard to do this, as well as our office in Edmonton and the people who assisted getting tickets and other such things. So there are numerous people, and I fear I might miss someone, and so I'm not going to try the full list. This conference would not be what it was if we had not had Andriy Makuk, the Associate Research Director of the Research and Educational Center. Andriy belongs to those gentle souls who are able to prod and remind academics and send them back the papers and get them along to maybe add a few more things. And he did I think, a wonderful job in overseeing much of the academic activity of this. And really, the job that our executive director, Marta Baziuk, has done has been outstanding in making this amazing.